All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Grace Andrews, and you are at my talk /backslash workshop. So thanks so much for watching or for attending. I'm really excited to have you here today. And we're going to be talking today about finding your authentic voice through effective storytelling. This whole entire conference, this whole entire gathering is about storytelling. So it's not out of scope that we're going to be talking about it. But what I really want you to walk away from this experience with is an understanding of how your story is about you. The primary person inside of your story is yourself. And I've had a lot of practice telling my story for a number of reasons. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about myself to get us going. So this is an image of Anansi the spider. So not everyone is going to know who Anansi the spider is. Don't worry, there's not going to be like a pop quiz at the end. You're not going to get in trouble. But Anansi the spider is a spider god, and Anansi is actually from my cultural tradition. So I am originally from Ghana, West Africa. I am part of, what are called the Akan people in what is now Ghana and some of Togo and a little bit of Burkina Faso. And Anansi is our god, or the collective cultural god of mischief. And so growing up when I was a little girl, Anansi stories were some of my favorite stories. And what was really great about Anansi stories is inside of Anansi stories, I would hear people who had names like mine. So not my name, Grace, but my indigenous or my tribal name, Aresi. I would hear, stories of places that reminded me of Ghana, or at least the Ghana that was in my mind. And so even from some of my earliest experiences, since we came to the US when I was about 5, I could go into this world of stories where I could see myself represented culturally. I could see myself represented linguistically. I could see myself represented creatively. And it's one of my earliest experiences with the power of stories, because I remember how much I loved to read. As soon as I learned how to read, I consumed books. I still do. These days it's audiobooks while I'm, getting my 30 minutes of movement outside daily, but it's still reading in a way. And I really loved going on these adventures to these new worlds. And most of all, I loved feeling like I was getting to understand someone else better. The irony of it was that a lot of the stories we read didn't have little girls who looked like me. They didn't have people who had accents like I used to when I was younger, or like my family still does. There weren't people who, when I heard the stories of their lives, I thought, oh, wow, this really reminds me of my life. And that's really where this authenticity piece really comes to play. We start to understand that the story is actually a channeling. It is a funnel for the voice that's being brought to life through the story. And so I usually tell an Anansi story, but I'm not going to tell an Anansi story just in the interest of time. But I will tell a story that kind of ties into this towards the end. So, every time I get asked about what I do at work, I always say I'm a storyteller. But what does that really mean? And how do we bring our authentic selves into the stories that we are trying to tell? So here are some of the methodologies. These are like scientifically proven. And I say scientifically proven a little tongue in cheek, right? So what we're looking at right here is actually I've borrowed it from the internet and through research, as well as through just my own exploration into storytelling. So what is the power of a good story? Why do we even get drawn into the story? And there are many reasons that effective storytelling is powerful. One is that just like our brains are wired to hear, or not necessarily hear, that's a little ableist, but what I mean is experience what we are taking in, right? So our inputs become the foundation of not only our imagination, but the way in which we react to it. And so storytelling actually does a lot of the same things that other activities do to our minds. So for instance, MRI scans reveal that when you are reading or when you are hearing a story and you hear words or read words or experience words like perfume or coffee or chocolate, your olfactory system activates, and your olfactory system is tied into your sense of smell. So this is really interesting, right? Because already if I tell an effective story and I say, this morning, I got up and I brewed an incredibly aromatic cup of coffee from beans that I had gotten while traveling in East Africa with a group of my closest friends. You're transported to my kitchen. You're smelling the coffee. Now I've taken you to Ethiopia, so maybe you're, imagining what it's like to be inside of a dwelling having a traditional coffee ceremony or just any of those things. You're starting to make all these connections that I haven't even begun to describe. I simply said, I'm making coffee, but I am making coffee that I got in Ethiopia when I was with a group of friends, right? So our brains begin to adapt to pick up particular words that then intrigue us, excite us, and engage us. And so having your voice, and so not just like your spoken voice, but having your perspective front and center in a story is actually transporting someone somewhere. And that is honestly the greatest gift of storytelling. And there's a couple of other, points that are on this slideshow that I'm not going to spend too much on. But what I do want to draw your eye to is when we are talking about the hormones and the endorphins that are released when people hear stories, specifically when they are invested in the story, when they are captivated by the story, they start to react as if they are experiencing it. And everyone kind of always says, okay, well, how do you tell a good story? And I always say the best place to begin to tell a powerful story is to speak your truth. And I'm going to be a little timely because it's today, it's Tuesday, it's March 9th, and you've probably by this point have heard about the interview that's been seen around the world, right? Meghan Markle, Prince Harry sat down with Oprah Winfrey, and it was definitely, in the colloquialisms of today, hot tea. And what's very interesting about that is that we were able to feel a very real experience and have a very real reaction to the stories that we were hearing from Meghan and from Harry. And what's really cool about that is we get to experience it with them, right? And so I'll tell you, watching some of that interview, hearing what Meghan Markle had been through and experiencing that with her it really allowed me to be able to, as a participant, it allowed for me to feel the emotions, like, when she was talking about her time being a bit depressed, when she was talking about just the sorrow she felt. I was sad. I was taken somewhere. I was transported into a world. And Meghan wasn't exactly telling a story, right? She was doing an interview. But the thing is, her story came through because her voice was front and center and present. And that's the power of effective storytelling, especially when your goal in your storytelling is just to be able to show up as yourself. So when we talk about showing up as ourselves, I know that a lot of people can feel stress about that. A lot of us are not necessarily, prone to sharing about ourselves. We're not exactly of the variety who maybe lead with stories about our experiences because we either want to make space for other people, don't want to be judged, or simply just want to be able to exist without explanation, right? And what I find about effective storytelling is it lets you speak those truths that allow you to feel free. And the fear you feel prior to sharing your story is almost always relieved once you do. And so I'm going to tell you all a story about a moment when I told a story that was deeply personal for me, and in this scenario that I did it, and then we are going to talk about the story. So let me go to the next slide to serve as our backdrop. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and we are going to go and talk about the rules of storytelling. But before we look at these rules, I want to tell you a story. So I'm on a couple of boards because, as my brother says, I love working for free, or as I say, I love to give back, tomato, tomato. And one of the boards that I'm on is actually for my institution, my undergraduate institution, which is currently embroiled in a lot of difficult conversations. And we're embroiled in a lot of difficult conversations because we are named after a Confederate general, specifically Robert E. Lee. And I won't get into too much of the details about that. You can Google it. We're in the same boat as a lot of other institutions who are either named after various historical individuals or who also have been, subject to histories that have not been very, kind or empathetic or uplifting or positive in any way. And we have the Young Alumni Board, and we meet regularly and we have a lot of conversations and we support our institution in any way that we can. Long story short, in the interest of time, is we're currently having a conversation that we don't have any say over the decision, but we're currently having a conversation about some initiatives that have been student or alumnus driven, and that's been focused on changing the name. Because once again, Robert E. Lee's name is in the name of the university. And so we were speaking with a body of students who've started a group or a commission to make a few demands of the university. And they were asking us how we felt about the name change and how we felt about just the current climate of the institution. And, the school I went to didn't admit women until 1985. The students of color that came, particularly Black students, came in the late 60s, early 70s. So one can imagine that my presence on campus in the early 2000s was still a bit new as, a Black woman. And so I really wanted to tell them the truth, but at the same time, the truth for me, especially in regards to the name, is so complicated, especially because of the experiences I had at the university. So I told them a story about my name, specifically the fact that my name is Grace Andrews, but I am an Indigenous and Native, West African and of, tribal lineage and identity, and how I felt about my own name and how, my name itself is both my name and not my name, right? There's so much history baked into the fact that I, as an Indigenous person, have a surname that's Andrews, a surname that's Scottish, when I myself do not identify as such, when I do not trace my lineage there. And unlike a lot of other Indigenous and Native Africans, I do have family lineage that has, been subject to enslavement and has also been a victim of colonization. And I told them just the story of my feelings about my name, how every time I hear my name, sometimes I don't feel like someone is talking to me or talking about me because that name feels so incredibly foreign. And as I spoke on that, specifically how, it doesn't always necessarily make me feel good to think of how I got my name, where my name came from, and what historical cultural things occurred in order for me to be named Grace Andrews. But excuse me. But what I did say is those complexities around my name are also so complicated even further because I do love my family. I do have a really positive relationship with my parents, specifically my father, who that is his surname. And how what I found is it's about the character of the person with the name. For me, am I going to change my name? Maybe one day I will. But, for now, I'm Grace Andrews, and I can sit with both the complicated feelings and the pride that comes from my name. And, sharing that story, I think really allowed people to know something that they did not know about me. Some of the people on that call had known me. Now they've known me for like 15, 16 years. They didn't know that about me. And it was an opportunity for me to, instead of just saying, oh, well, the name change of the institution is complicated, and then kind of just moving on, I was able to bring them into my story for them to understand my feelings, the turmoil, the joy, the pride, the complexity fully by telling them my truth, right? And so that's the power of an effective story. It's not, I always say, the story is not for the audience always. Sometimes an effective story is one that sets the storyteller free. And so I've compiled a couple of rules for how you can find your voice and tell an effective story. So these are just, they're kind of catchy, but I'll talk about them a little bit more and you'll understand that they're not as flashy as they may seem. So rule number one about effective storytelling and finding your authentic voice is don't be a robot. Like a lot of folks, when they go to tell a story, they're like, hi, my name is Grace, and I am talking to you today. And no disrespect to robots, they are the future, they are here. But that's not necessarily the way that you should tell your story. So I always advise to folks who get nervous or who struggle with, public speaking, that you should find what's comfortable for you. And I'm really big on totems and having things on me that make me feel comfortable. So maybe you want to wear like your favorite earrings, or you want to put on, a bracelet that speaks to you. I love to wear lipstick that I feel like is a part of my mood in that moment. I always call it like my lipstick armor. And that might sound silly, but it really makes me remember, especially when you're looking at yourself like we are these days on video chats and video, remote conferences. It makes me remember, okay, I'm still Grace. And so I always try to do something that automatically makes me comfortable and allows me to be less stiff. Secondly, be sexy. Now, I'm not saying like be sexy, like wear something revealing, or, that's your personal preference, not here to judge or shame. But what I mean by be sexy is be provocative. Don't be afraid to say what you want to say and how you want to say it, and really build intimacy and create closeness, right? And I think, that's why I kind of led with that story about me speaking to my fellow board and also speaking to, that student group. It went to show that I was building trust. I'm telling you something that only 8 other people experienced with me, and now you've experienced with me. And so I always try to share something in my talks, or when I'm on stage, or even when I'm just talking one-on-one to coworkers or to my boss, that is deeply personal and deeply telling of me. And that doesn't mean you need to give them a full, medical history. What I mean is sometimes people just want to know who you are. So maybe it means it's telling them what you did with your family this weekend, or it means, you telling them like a project you're working on. It doesn't have to be the most revealing thing ever. It just needs to reveal something about you. Third, give them eyes. So what do I mean by that? I mean, really look at the audience. If we were live, I would be trying to look at every single person, but not in a creepy way. I would simply just pick a couple of people at different points in the audience and make eye contact with them. So I'm not saying stare at them like this. I'm saying, just a gentle linger and then move on to someone else's eyes. And what that does is it automatically brings nearness. And so what I mean by that is we start to feel emotionally close because we are actively talking to one another and we are actively participating with our eyes, right? Those hormone responses, all of the things that people are feeling, now you're feeling it with them as you look into their eyes while you tell your story. Fourth, cause a disruption. So this one is my favorite because what I mean is it lets you be creative. Like, what is disruption for you? Today, I don't think I'm causing much of a disruption, but sometimes I just like to have a lingering last thing that I can tell the audience that will wake them up if they're bored, or will get them on the edge of their seats just to make sure they're listening, right? So always putting something fun in the middle. A lot of times talks start fun or they end fun, but the middle can be, so I like to do stuff like what I just did, right? So if you weren't paying attention, you're like, oh wait, is she making noises? Did she growl? What's happening? And so just little things like that may be your own personal tics that allow for your audience to really be shaken up a little bit if they're falling asleep. So, using your voice as that disruption is my favorite way to do it. I love to do things like I always say, like clap your hands, or, sing a song, or just the intonation of your voice, right? Just something to really bring the audience in. And even though this sounds like a tactic that only works if you're giving talks, this also works in everyday conversation. I found that a lot of times when we're talking, we're sleepwalking through our conversations with people, and having tonality, having dimension is really, really helpful for being able to connect, and once again, to bring your story to life and pull people in. And then the last two tips are some of my favorites. So the fifth one is have spies. So what I mean by that is, if you're giving a talk or you're doing a presentation, bring people who make you feel safe, who you can look at into the audience, see their face and feel really good, or who can, if it's got a Q&A, can ask you a softball question to really get you going after you give a presentation or a talk. In the workplace, the way that I do this is with allies at meetings. I always try to have a friend or two, if I can, on my teams. And so usually I succeed in that. And when we go to meetings, before we go to meetings, I say, like, I'm going to bring up this topic. It's not that you have to back me up, but could you ask a couple of questions to get people going? And it's a way to, once again, start putting things and processes in place that make you feel comfortable, but allow for you to be successful. And then the last one, which is, I think the most important, is be yourself. The secret to finding an authentic voice is knowing who you are. And in order to know who you are, you've really got to call on a few things, and that's your history. And you have to speak in a language that makes sense, that are your words. Like, some people, maybe in everyday life, they speak really plainly or casually, but then they go on a stage and they're using, 30-point Scrabble words. And you're like, who is that person, right? You always say, want to engage in a conversation, whomever you're speaking to, whether it's an audience or an individual. So just be so mindful of your words and just speak how you would speak. And once again, use your experiences to bring up memories that build trust. The beauty of storytelling is that it can be and transport you anywhere. And especially for people who are working in social justice, people who are working in movements, people who are we're going to regular work, right? Being so mindful of why you're telling the story and who you're telling the story for, because good stories compel people to change. They change the way we feel, they change the way we think, they change the way we act, and they change the way we behave. So that story I told you earlier about speaking at my, at that small group meeting, afterwards, even during, people messaged me and texted me and thanked me for sharing the story. And they said it really gave them a deeper understanding of how I was approaching the whole entire scenario, and the kind of empathy I'd be bringing into, handling whatever decision my university chooses to make. And so that's an example of how I could have just said one or two sentences, but instead I chose to tell them a 4 or 5 minute story, because that was so much more who I am, and such a better, example of what I was trying to say than me even just saying words. And that's what I really want to leave you with, is sometimes we're scared to say the things we need to say, but if you tell them in a story, it becomes a lot easier to make space for not just your voice, but a chorus of other voices. And so with that, we have come to the end of the presentation. I also think we've come to my allotted time. So I really hope everyone, enjoyed the session, but most importantly, I really hope that you've been able to walk away with an idea of how you can tell a story. And so I really want to encourage folks to, if you would like, get in contact with me. I would love to hear your story. I'd love to talk about your story. You can find me at grace@asprinklingofgrace.com. You can find me at my website, asprinklingofgrace.com. You can find me on Instagram at GraceMSC. And that's also my Twitter handle, but I'm never on Twitter. And the underscore is not there. But I really kind of can't wait to hear more about who you are and the voice that you want to use in the world. So thank you once again.